emissions, it looks like this is, so this is, I don't know if I can make that big. I don't think so. Is that clear enough that you can see without the, this is one of the graphs that was cut, and I'll get to your consumption and production question. So this is looking at just the different emissions over time from these different groups of countries. This is the total emissions. This is the contentious part here. Here's developed high-income countries. High-income country emissions are plateauing. Upper middle-income countries are rising. So which countries do you need?
Like that example of an upper middle income.
OPEC countries, for example. Countries that, I don't know if China qualifies as upper middle income anymore, or lower middle income. But what you see is kind of these countries here, their emissions are rising quite quickly. I'm pretty sure actually China and India are in here. China, India, Brazil. Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the graphs that was cut. I'll get to April's question. This talks about production and consumption. This, unfortunately, this is the same thing that I just showed, basically, right? This is emissions from high income and upper middle income. But the different colors show production and consumption. So most of our emissions up here are from consumption. Most of the emissions down here are from production. So that is one, even though these guys hated this graph and said, hey, we have to cut this, that's really important information that was lost. So there is already a good bit of data on this that allowed us to produce this graph, and I don't, fortunately, I don't know the data behind the graph. But that was information that was lost that was really important information. Okay? I'm going to jump back up unless there are other questions. Yeah?
And perhaps you'll talk about some, I'm interested in some of the models that are generated. Are those climate models, are those generated by the IPCC, or are those done by the research and then?
I will get into this if you allow me to come back. Yeah.
With this slide, is it hard to delineate the upper income with the rising income? If the top one is from consumption and the second one down is from production, isn't that production being driven by the consumption in the top one? And so this could be kind of false blame on those second tier countries and letting the top countries off the hook.
Exactly. And so that's the point. They cut this graph, but that point is also a very important one that they lost as a result as well.
So it's not just corruption that cut the slide. You left me with some hope. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So then we'll jump back up. Oops. Sorry. Give me a minute. I apologize. Let's see if I'm technologically savvy enough to continue. So now we're going to jump into what we actually found in our report. So that was kind of the process and how this whole thing comes about. This we talked about largely already, just that this is a big animal of a report. Tons of people feed into it, tons of comments feed into it. This is kind of unique to working group 3. So what we do, the UNFCCC process, as I said, those guys are the ones that make the policy. We don't. We just feed in and tell them about what happens if they choose certain things. So the way that we come into this, when we write this report, is there are a bunch of different possible goals, right? So say, okay, this climate change thing is a problem. So we want to try to limit temperature to 2 degrees. Then we'll look at all the different ways we can do that this way. And these little clouds represent the uncertainties along the way. Right? So our goal by writing this report is to say, if you want to get a 2-degree target, this is what you would have to do, and these are the uncertainties involved. If you want to do 3 degrees, that's a different set. That's a different pathway, and you'd have to do different things. Or if you want to, just say, we don't care, here are the repercussions for that, and these are the pathways forward for that. But it's not our job to recommend one way forward, right? We view the UNFCCC, the policymakers, as the ones that say, okay, we choose A, B, or C. We just tell them what happens if you choose A, B, or C. Which is why, again, we link to this honest broker perspective, because we aren't saying you have to do 2 degrees. We're saying if this is what society decides is the right thing, this is how to get there, this is what the compromises are. Okay, so this graph you probably all know and love already. This just shows what's happening with the greenhouse gas emissions over time and what has been happening. On the right you have today, and on the left you have the 1970s. And the big point of this graph is emissions are rising. They're rising, they're rising, they're rising. And the last decade, actually, we've seen them growing faster than any other decade in the past. So emissions are going crazy, right? So that's the big point of this. The other important point is here. Most of these emissions are carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion. So this is where a bulk of it is coming from. Okay, now we're going to get into your question on the models. No, the short answer is no. The IPCC, we do not have our own models. Again, everything we do is based on volunteers. So this graph is a result of the models that we looked at. So when we started the AIR5 process, we put out a call to go across the whole world and said, hey guys, and what we're interested in here is what are called integrated assessment models. Each of the different working groups look at different types of models. Ours are integrated assessment models. They look at the economy, they look at the different sectors. They do have little climate models that help tell what's going on, but mostly we're interested in the economic part of it. So we put out a call to all the guys that are doing integrated assessment models and said, hey guys, are you interested in giving us your data for this big comparison project that we're going to do? And 31 different teams across the world said yes. So these 31 different teams sent us all their data that added up into 1,100 different scenarios, I think. So we have this huge database that's in Austria at the moment of all the different data from all the different scenarios. And you can see what this is the top line of the database. So these are the really high guys and these are the little low guys. And all the scenarios fall into the middle. So what this graph is showing us right now, the integrated assessment models tell us a ton. This is just one slice of what they tell us. And this is looking at greenhouse gas emissions over time in the future, looking at 2100. And what we're seeing here is just the business as usual. What is it if nothing changes, right? If we continue to just, don't put any policies in place, then it looks like emissions are going to keep rising and keep rising and keep rising. So this is what the scenarios say. If we don't do anything, this is what's going to happen. And what this means, then we start working with working group 1. These are the physical science guys. And they say, okay, well, if this is what we do with emissions, that's accompanied by up to an 8-degree Celsius increase in temperature, global temperature. So that, of course, that's 14 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That's huge. So that's what it could be. That's the high end. I'm not giving the full spectrum. The full spectrum is down to 3.4. But it could be as high as 8 degrees Celsius. What that would mean, it differs, of course, all over the world, but think about summers of Gunnison. Your summer isn't going to be 80 degrees anymore, it's going to be 94. So it's, it's a big deal. But you'll have to talk more with Katie and colleagues about that. So here again, as I said, we're presenting different pathways forward. Now, if we have politicians who say, hey, okay, this is serious, we want to try to go for this 2-degree target or this 3-degree target. These are the different scenarios for getting down there. And what 2 degrees says, if you look just at 2 degrees, you're going to, both. In both cases, you have to cut emissions, really. Like, you can't, this is business as usual. We're going to have to start decreasing emissions. And at 2 degrees, roughly half of our emissions by 2050, our emissions will have to be cut in half if we're going to reach 2 degrees. If we're going to reach 2 degrees by 2100, those emissions are almost near zero. Right? So that's huge. Any questions thus far? No. Okay, moving on. So, as I said, these integrated assessment models, they look at a bunch of different sectors. So we have here, we've got land use, so this is forestry and agriculture. electricity, transport, buildings, industry, and on the right you have, so this is all carbon dioxide here, and on the right you have all those other gases. And what this graph is looking at is, again, what happens if nothing happens? If nothing happens, policy-wise, all these little dotted lines are where we are today. Emissions are showing to increase in every single sector. So it's not just one sector, it's not just energy. There are increases in emissions in the others, but it is mostly electricity. And most of our emissions are coming from electricity generation. The agriculture and forestry sector is the only one that's projected to decline. And that's because the ability of trees to suck up that CO2 again. So this again is what we're doing if we don't change. So this is the same graph, but now we're looking at 2 degrees overlaid. So remember, here was our increase in emissions. In the different sectors, this is what would be required if we were going to reach 2-degree targets across the different sectors. So you're going to have to decrease in all the different sectors, but a ton in energy, a ton in electricity. So now the next graph I'm going to show, I'm just going to focus on energy for a minute just because of this huge cut, but that does not mean to underplay the role of the other sectors. They're really important as well. Okay, this graph is, what this is showing is if you look, you have 2 different, so this is where we are tentatively in 2030. Again, we're coming from these integrated assessment models who are telling us this. This is where we are in 2030. Now this is looking only at 2 degrees, right? So if in 2030, and sorry, I should talk about what we're talking about an increase in low carbon energy. So if we're going to cut all these emissions, we can't just stop using electricity. We need to replace it with some low carbon energy sources, right? And what we qualify as low carbon is a lot renewable energy, but we also look at nuclear, we also look at things like carbon capture and storage, which is where fossil fuel plants are generating, but then sticking that carbon back underground. That technology is new. It's not yet proven. This is why these models are making different assumptions about those technologies, which I'll get to in a second. So, in a 2-degree scenario, they're saying, all right, already by 2030 you have a huge increase in low carbon. By 2050, you're going up either like a tripling or quadrupling of low carbon energy by 2050. By 2100, you're almost phasing out fossil fuels that don't have CCS completely. So you're more or less replacing the whole electricity sector with low carbon energy by 2100 if you want to reach a 2-degree target. And we're not saying that's what they want. If that's what they want, that's what you have to do. This is looking at 3 degrees. At 3 degrees you have, again, a tripling of renewable energy, low carbon energy by 2050, but not at the same levels as 2 degrees, right? So you can have a different target here if you want to reach 3 degrees. Yeah.
Are these graphs saying, like, just for the electricity sector, so would that be in combination with other sectors, or if, like, other sectors such as maybe like transport continued at a business as usual pace, and that's what would be required in the electricity sector? Or are these
What
like...
the integrated assessment models do, they look at how all of the different sectors interplay with each other. So these graphs do assume steps in the different sectors as well, which are not covered by this graph. This is only the snippet of what does it say about energy. So there are things happening as well in transport. And that's why I said this is a bit misleading presenting only one sector, because they're all important. Really important things are happening in transport and buildings and other things as well. Yeah.
Does that include life cycle and material flows for those, for the production of like solar panels and things like that?
I am not a modeler myself, but I'm quite sure these guys are taking account in almost everything that they can. I think you may be able to say more about that than I do.
Yeah, I think this is mostly at the point of production, right? So this is what emissions must decrease at the point of production in order to meet these standards.
Yeah, sorry.
So we've mentioned these goals like the 2 degrees and the 3 degrees. Are these put forth by the scientists? Or are any goals ever put forth by governments? And then science somehow conforms and tries to say that's possible.
Good question. Multi-layers to the answer.
Sure.
There is one target, the 2-degree target, that is very hot in negotiations at the moment. This is the one where, and this again is the adaptation guys are going to be able to talk more about this, and the vulnerability guys, where they say, okay, because what the UNFCCC says, they want to avoid what's considered to be dangerous. So the guys who look at what impacts there are, they say, well, we think getting above 2 degrees could have more dangerous impacts than others. So the UNFCCC, and this is not all governments, there are some governments, like small island states, who really push for a 1.5 degree target because they'll be underwater at 2 degrees. So there are a bunch of different reasons, but the UNFCCC does say, we're particularly interested in 2 degrees, tell us what that means, but give us the full spectrum. So this is why we concentrate on 2 degrees a little bit, but also present everything else. Okay? Okay. So this is what I think is actually the most interesting, or one of the most interesting things about what's new in our report. So as I said, there's been 5 of these reports before, and they've all been looking at these different models and what the models say about what we have to do. This time, when we started this, which was in 2008, people started to say, you know, maybe the governments aren't going to do what we think they're going to do. So they started to think, you know, all of our models always say, you know, we predict the best case scenario. We think people are going to do, you know, exactly what's meant, but they don't always. So what happens if, you know, there's a delay in an agreement? What happens if governments can't agree until 2030? What happens if technologies aren't available? Like what's happening in Germany is really interesting at the moment. I'm going to diverge, but I'll come back. The Germans have now decided to outlaw nuclear energy completely. So now you have to look at what happens if you don't have nuclear available. What happens if carbon capture and storage turns out it doesn't work? Then you have to look at, well, okay, that's a whole different package of possibilities. So this is what we did this time, is we looked at second best worlds, we say. What happens if politicians don't agree? What happens if technology is not available? And these kinds of things. So this graph is what I'm going to use to explain, to focus on delay, because I particularly find delay interesting. So this graph, what this is, we're focusing again on 2 degrees. So we're looking at emissions, right? We know this. We're looking over time, just to 2030. We're looking at a limited basis. So these are all the different scenarios put together by all these different modeling teams, just looking at 2 degrees. So these are all the different ways. Okay, wait, but there's an important point here. This is assuming a perfect world. This is assuming politicians agree tomorrow that something really important needs to happen, and we're going to start to peak our emissions, right? So we're going to peak here. This is a perfect world. These are all the different ways that we can get there, the different modeling teams across the world say. So what does this mean? This is the emissions. So it's the same thing we talked about already, just presented in a different way. If you want to do this, this means here are our emissions in a baseline scenario. This is if we do nothing. If we want to reach 2 degrees, this is where emissions have to decrease to. Okay? So you have this decrease in emissions. Same graph as I showed before. This is also the same graph as I showed before in a different place. This is your low carbon energy. So you have to decrease emissions, and you also have a huge upscaling of low carbon energy. Here's the point that's important. This number here. That's a 3%. Oh no, forgive me, I'm jumping far. I'm jumping further than I have to. This decrease in emissions is a 3% per year decrease in emissions. Remember at the beginning when I said emissions are increasing faster than ever? So decreasing emissions by 3% per year is something we've never seen before, never. It's huge. And again, you have this huge increase in low carbon energy to accompany that. Okay, so this is where we get into the not perfect world. This is our assumption that governments aren't going to do anything until 2030. Okay, so what we see until 2030, and this is what we see already. This is the Cancun pledges is an agreement made by the UNFCCC, just to show where they're talking about right now, right? That what the UNFCCC is talking about is already not good enough to meet these kind of targets. So you're looking at these up here. This assumes governments aren't going to do anything until 2030, after which emissions are going to have to go down this direction. But we're still going to say, okay, for at least till 2030, we're going to continue to increase. Okay? So, let me jump pages. What we see with this, as the emissions continue to increase, and as there's delay, the challenges of reaching a 2-degree target or any target also increase. Right? The longer you wait, the harder it gets. So here's the point where I was talking about before. This is our 3% decrease per year to reach a 2-degree target. If we want to reach a 2-degree target and we don't do anything until 2030, that means emissions are going to have to decrease by 6% per year. So it's really a big doubling of the effort that's required, and the challenges that come get bigger and bigger. And the same thing happens with your low carbon energy source. If you're down here still, by 2030, you have to, you had a 90% increase here, but now that increases to 240%. So the longer you wait, again, the more action you have to take faster. So that's the kind of thing that I found most interesting. There we go. Okay, just looking at investment numbers, this also comes from our integrated assessment models. If we want to do this, again, we're looking at 2 degrees because that's our number in question at the moment. If we want to do 2 degrees, these are how much investment, or what would change in investment numbers across the different technologies if we're going to do this. So of course, here's the 0 mark. You see a huge decrease in fossil fuels. Right? The investment in fossil fuel decreases by about $30 billion. When on the other side, you're looking at energy efficiency, this is across the different sectors. Energy efficiency investments go sky high, an increase in $336 billion. And then you have your low carbon energy as well over here. They've also increased by $147 billion. So you have a very big shift in the way that money is moved in the different sectors if we're going to do this. This is just an example, actually, of one of the things that the integrated assessment models look at. I'm coming to the end. I know we're watching me, I know I'm running short on time. Forgive me. This is a cartoon that I'm not sure who posted, actually. It talks about the IPCC over time. At the beginning, in our first assessment report, we say, oh, this climate change thing, it's a problem. And then over time, they say, yeah, guys, it's a problem. And by 2001, they're saying, we might want to start dealing with this climate change thing. Sorry to sound like a broken record. By this year, we really checked, guys, we're not making this up. And finally, in 2019, he starts tapping the microphone. But really, I don't think the picture is as bleak. This is another part of our report. What we looked at is policies. Policies are increasing all over the place. Yes, there's the UNFCCC process, which is actually moving in a very positive direction at the moment. But we also have all these national policies in place. So all these countries are doing it. And even I know, even the U.S., a lot of people are wondering about what we're doing on the federal level. But the states are doing a lot, and the cities are doing a lot. So things are happening. And things are really moving forward. So it's not, we don't have to feel like this guy, oops, I think I might have killed it. We don't have to feel like this guy, like really there's nothing happening, and we don't have to feel sad, because things are really changing. So I like to end on a positive note, because otherwise it's And I put this together just because I think it's an important point about what you can do, because individuals really matter in this game. And I highlight just the first one and the last one. Know your carbon footprint. What kind of energy are we using? What am I using? Is there anything I can do to stop using that much? Because everything we use makes a difference. Every individual is important. And also the last one, talk about climate change. I'm pointing just this morning at the little bed and breakfast where I'm saying I had a woman asking me, she said, oh, I heard climate change isn't real. So it's all been shown as a hoax. It's like, okay. So have these conversations. There's so much misinformation out there. You guys are the ones who know what's real, who know the science, who can have these conversations. So do it. It's important. Support legislation. And then just as a last point, everything we do is free online. You can download it all. This is the website for the mitigation report, but if you look up IPCC, you'll find it. It's downloadable by chapter, so you don't need to get all 2,000 pages. You can just get what you're interested in. And with that, I am done.
How about we take a couple of questions, maybe 2 questions, and then we break, and then come back at 10:30, right? Is that okay, Corey? Anna? Yeah? Okay.
Going back a few slides in the one with the energy use getting cut off immediately, how does population growth play into these projections?
That's a great question. Largely that'll be a question for a modeler, but one of the things that we did was looked at the different drivers of emissions. And what they saw was population growth was a huge driver of emissions, right? And so we're expecting emissions to increase because of population growth largely. But there's 2 pieces. Population, unfortunately, not unfortunately. Population is a very sensitive thing to touch politically. So we're not China, we don't want to implement measures on population increases. So we mostly focus on economic measures, what it means for the economy. Population is a big driver. It does have a big impact on this, but we don't typically touch that.
And so they're not very much, or they're not.
It will be, I mean, what these oh, sorry, I meant to get there. Maybe it's faster for me to do this. The models do consider population growth in these numbers. They do not consider population policy. I guess is a better way to say that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, just give me your unique insight perspective on this whole process. Do you feel like, one, that it's been effective in actually disseminating into policy and transforming that transformation into policy and action? Or, and then 2, if you could change or add something to this process, what would be?
That is a really hard question.
Yeah, sorry.
I do think it has an impact for two reasons. One, I think governments wouldn't fight so hard about it if it didn't. And also, what these reports are shown to be, because they have this government seal, that's when, so you can basically say all the government, okay, not all, but 194 governments across the world say this is fact, say this is scientifically okay. So it's used as kind of a status quo for research moving forward, right? The IPCC has shown this with a government seal that this is happening. So moving forward, how do we do this? And I personally had another really nice input. I don't know if you heard, there was a big agreement between China and the U.S. just before this big UNFCCC meeting that was happening. And the guy who negotiated this for us, for the U.S., called my co-chair and thanked him and said, you know, we really relied a lot on the AR5 as we were putting this thing together, so thanks. And so that really, so of course then, you know, he told all of us and we feel very proud. But it's a nice thing if a policymaker does come and say, hey, we used this, it was really good. And what I would change, that is a subject of a high debate at the moment. I think one of the things that we need more of is one, I can't remember who asked me about regional input anymore. But a lot of the people, we're looking at global levels, and a lot of people that are interested in what we're doing want to know, how does this impact me? What does this mean for Gunnison? What does this mean for Colorado? And we don't cover that really, and because it's a whole nother, it's a whole nother report. But right now, because our mandate comes from the UNFCCC, we're a body of the UN, we're here for the UN, our main client base isn't the public right now. And I think if we really wanted to have a better impact, we could try to expand and do this, but again, that's a question of finance and resources. And I also think, outreach-wise, I see a huge, as I said, a huge misinformation campaign, and I don't necessarily see that being balanced in the public by the right information. And again, it's a question of resources. We don't have money to pay for commercials and such things about what's really happening, what the science is really about. So if there were two things to improve, again, finances and resources aside, those would be things I'd like to see, just as from my own Kristen Saban perspective.
Shall we break? 15 minutes. Kristen is going to be around, and she's offered to stick around for ENVS.